For a lot of believers, reading the Old Testament is like walking through an art museum. You stop at a painting of David and Goliath, move over to Daniel in the lion's den, and then exit. You see a series of flat, disconnected stories. But studying Old Testament theology asks you to step outside the museum, climb a mountain, and look down at the entire terrain in 3 dimensions. That 3-dimensional view is rare. Even though the Old Testament makes up almost 3/4 of the Bible, most Christians rarely venture past the Psalms, Proverbs, and a handful of familiar Sunday school narratives. The dense legal codes of Leviticus or the intense visions of the minor prophets are often left completely untouched. Old Testament theology is the specific discipline designed to fix this. It functions as a bridge. On one side, you have pure exegesis, translating and analyzing individual verses. On the other side, you have systematic theology, the way a church structures its modern doctrine. Old Testament theology sits right in the middle, trying to figure out what the entire Hebrew Bible actually says about God. But when you try to step up to that mountaintop view and buy an Old Testament theology textbook, you hit a wall. The academic field is deeply splintered. You will find scholars using diametrically opposed methods, arguing over entirely different ways to read the exact same text. Understanding the Old Testament requires choosing between these competing maps. Because no single volume perfectly captures the massive terrain, you have to decide which perspective you actually need. These competing maps exist because scholars disagree on several core flashpoints. They debate the degree of unity across the biblical books. They argue over whether theology should purely describe what ancient Israelites believed or prescribe how the modern church should behave today. These arguments date back to the late 1700s, when a scholar named Johann Gabler demanded a strict separation between historical biblical theology and modern dogmatic theology. He wanted scholars to focus strictly on the original ancient context rather than modern applications. Over the last few decades, that initial split has grown into a labyrinth of competing approaches. For a seminary student or a pastor trying to write a sermon, wading into this academic debate usually leads to analysis paralysis. To navigate this, we are going to use the book Understanding Old Testament Theology by Brittany Kim and Charlie Trim as our guide. Kim and Trim argue that to find your way, you have to understand the 3 structural categories scholars use to build their maps: history, theme, and context. This matrix shows how the different academic approaches compare. We'll start by looking at the top row, the historical approach. The inputs for this method rely heavily on the historical critical method and detailed comparisons to ancient Near Eastern cultures. The core objective here is backward-looking. The scholar is trying to reconstruct the world behind the text to discover exactly what ancient Israel believed in their specific time and place. The outcome is a clear reconstruction of ancient Israel's original beliefs. It provides a sharp, localized understanding of what the text meant to its original audience thousands of years ago. The trade-off is authority. By treating the text as a historical artifact, this approach limits its role as a guide for modern behavior. It describes what happened then, rather than what should happen now. The historical approach makes you an expert on the ancient past. But if you have to stand in front of a congregation on Sunday and tell them how to apply the text to their lives today, this map leaves you stranded. Moving down the matrix, we find the second row, the thematic approach. Instead of focusing purely on history, this method searches for a single unifying concept or center to act as an input. Walter Eichreich, for example, famously used the concept of covenant to organize the entire Old Testament. This approach organizes the massive, often chaotic collection of Old Testament books into a highly systematic and cohesive story. To maintain that clean central theme, the theologian inevitably has to smooth over the messy diversity and the contradictions found across the different biblical books. This creates intense debate among scholars. Gerhard von Rad, writing around the same time as Eichreich, vehemently denied that a central theme even existed, choosing instead to organize his theology around Israel's historical confessions. Thematic theology offers the easiest on-ramp for readers, but it achieves this cohesion by flattening the unique, sharp edges of the individual biblical authors. Finally, we reach the bottom row, the contextual approach. This involves reading the Old Testament through a specific lens, The input here is either the canonical lens of the Christian New Testament or the interpreter's modern social context. You read the ancient text with today's realities firmly in mind. This yields immediate relevance, connecting ancient texts directly to modern social issues, church doctrine, or the life of Jesus. The trade-off is that you risk retrojecting modern ideas backward. By rushing to New Testament fulfillment, you can easily overwrite the Old Testament's original voice. To see how these maps diverge, look at the book of Exodus. The historical map examines the plagues and Egyptian culture. The thematic map focuses on the Sinai covenant structure, and the contextual map views the Exodus as a precursor pointing toward Christ's salvation. Your chosen approach dictates what you hear. You will end up with the voice of ancient Israel, a synthesized academic concept, or a modern canonical application. Because these methods yield such different results, you have to accept that a perfect Old Testament theology book doesn't exist. It is a problem of cartography. Translating a complex three-dimensional reality onto a two-dimensional surface always results in distortion. This side-by-side comparison shows the problem. On the left, the Mercator projection preserves shapes but distorts sizes, making Greenland look as large as South America. On the right, the Gall-Peters projection depicts relative sizes accurately, but only by stretching the shapes of the continents. Theological approaches work the same way. Every method highlights one vital truth by intentionally downplaying another. You cannot preserve every detail of the ancient text while also creating a perfectly smooth modern summary. Since all theological maps contain distortions, identify the one best suited for your intended destination. Match your map to your goal. Pick historical to research the ancient world, select thematic for a unified, cohesive framework, or choose contextual to preach and connect the text to life today. Once you identify your chosen map, you can